The cold had stopped being painful hours ago. Now it was simply there, a living thing pressed against Anna's skin, seeping through her torn cloak, settling into her bones with each labored breath. She kept one hand locked against the swell of her belly, fingers splayed wide as if she could shield the 5 frantic heartbeats fluttering beneath her palm from the wolves that hunted her through the storm. 5 the healers had called her a liar when she'd first told them. Then they'd called her cursed. Then they'd driven her out into the snow to die. Behind her, cutting through the howl of the wind, came the hunting calls. Deep, resonant, promising blood. Her former pack had been tracking her for 3 days now. Ever since she'd fled the last village that had refused her shelter, they wanted her dead. More specifically, they wanted what was inside her dead. 5 impossible lives that shouldn't exist. That broke every law of nature the packs had known for generations. Anna's boot caught on something hidden beneath the snow. She went down hard, knees slamming into the frozen ground with enough force to punch the air from her lungs. Pain exploded through her swollen body and she gasped, the sound swallowed instantly by the screaming blizzard. Her hands flew protectively to her belly as tears froze on her cheeks. "Get up," she commanded herself, fingers digging into the snow. "Get up now. They're close. You can feel them. If you stay down, they'll tear these pups from your body before your heart stops beating." The memory of her mate's face flickered through her mind. Gentle eyes, calloused healer's hands. The way he'd wept with joy when the impossible pregnancy had taken hold. He'd died before he could even mark her properly. Killed in a border skirmish that should never have happened. Leaving her alone with 5 lives growing inside her that no one believed could survive. "They're wrong," she whispered into the storm, forcing her legs to move, to rise, to carry her forward, even though every muscle screamed in protest. "You're real. You're alive. I won't let them take you." She staggered through knee-deep drifts, her quiet wolf conserving every last scrap of strength to protect the lives within. Around her, the world had become nothing but white chaos and black skeleton trees, their branches clawing at the bleeding moon that hung above the storm clouds like a silent, indifferent witness. Then she saw them. The stones. Ancient grave markers carved with runes she couldn't read. Weathered symbols that seemed to pulse with faint warning even through the snow. Border markers. She'd heard the stories. Winterhold ruled by Alpha King Valenfrost, a man known not for mercy but for iron law and swift justice. Trespassers were executed. But behind her, the hunting howls were growing louder, closer, more certain. She could almost feel hot breath on her neck, imagine claws ripping through fabric and flesh. Anna pressed her back against the largest stone, the cold seeping through her cloak as she cradled her belly with both arms. Her legs wouldn't carry her any further. Her wolf had gone silent. The 5 heartbeats beneath her hands were all that remained. Frantic, desperate, clinging to life. Shapes emerged from the storm. Massive wolves with glowing eyes, their forms darker than the night itself, circling with predatory patience. She recognized the lead wolf's scarred muzzle, remembered him from the pack that had cast her out. He'd been the one who'd called her cursed, the one who'd suggested they end the abomination before it could take root. She pulled her pups closer, even knowing it was futile. Then the air changed. New wolves materialized from the opposite direction. Larger, silver-pelted, moving like liquid moonlight through the snow. The black wolves froze, their hunting circle breaking as the silver wolves formed a wall between Anna and death. The largest silver wolf stepped forward, and even through her fading consciousness, Anna felt the weight of his presence. Ancient, absolute, terrifying. He shifted, and the world tilted as Anna looked up into eyes that burned like molten silver. The man who stood before her was carved from winter itself. Tall, broad-shouldered, with silver-threaded black hair that fell past his collar and scars that mapped violence across his bare chest despite the freezing wind. He wore only torn trousers from the shift, steam rising from his skin as if the cold couldn't touch him. Alpha King Valenfrost. The black wolves hadn't moved, hadn't breathed. Their hunting formation had shattered the moment the silver wolves arrived, and now they stood frozen in something that looked disturbingly like terror. Valen didn't acknowledge them yet. His molten silver eyes were locked on Anna, specifically on the swell of her belly beneath her protective arms. His expression was unreadable. No disgust, no doubt, no pity, just an intensity that made her feel stripped bare despite her layers of torn clothing. How many? His voice was low, rough, cutting through the storm like a blade. Anna's lips were numb, her voice barely functional. She should lie. She should say one, maybe to something believable. But his eyes held hers with such unwavering focus that the truth fell from her frozen mouth before she could stop it. 5. The word dropped into the snow like a stone into still water. Silence. Even the wind seemed to pause. The lead-black wolf shifted, a grizzled warrior with cruel eyes that Anna recognized. Alpha King Valen, he rasped, his tone carefully neutral. This Omega is pack business. She has trespassed on your lands while fleeing lawful. Quiet. One word barely louder than a breath. The warrior's mouth snapped shut. Valen moved then, and Anna's failing body tensed as he approached. But instead of reaching for her, instead of grabbing her throat or calling for execution, the Alpha King of Winter Hold did something impossible. He went to one knee in the snow. Not bowing, not submitting. Kneeling as if the ground itself had pulled him down. He placed one large, scarred hand against the snow near her belly, his head tilting slightly, his eyes closed. The silver wolves behind him went utterly still, their ears pricked forward, their bodies vibrating with barely contained energy. Seconds stretched. Then Valen's eyes opened, and something raw and almost vulnerable flickered across his face before his expression hardened into iron certainty. I hear them, he said quietly, his voice carrying a wonder that seemed foreign to his battle-worn features. 5 heartbeats. Strong. Anna's wolf stirred for the first time in weeks, a faint, tentative response to power that didn't feel like a threat. Valen rose to his full height and turned toward the black wolves. The temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees. You have 3 seconds to leave my territory, he said, his voice now carrying the weight of absolute authority. If you are still breathing my air on the 4th, I will personally ensure you stop breathing entirely. Alpha King, you don't understand, the largest silver wolf snarled, thin lips pulling back from teeth the size of daggers. She's an abomination. The grizzled warrior stumbled backward. This isn't over. Yes, Valen said softly, dangerously. It is. The black wolves fled into the storm, their retreat frantic and undignified. Anna tried to thank him or ask what happened next, but her body had reached its limit. The adrenaline that had kept her moving for 3 days evaporated all at once. Her vision dwindled. Her legs buckled. Strong arms caught her before she hit the ground. Valen lifted her as if she weighed nothing, cradling her against his chest with unexpected gentleness. His body was furnace-hot against her frozen skin. She could feel his heartbeat steady, powerful, alive. "Stay with me," he commanded. And it wasn't a request. Anna's eyes fluttered closed. When they opened again, she was staring at an ornate ceiling carved with silver inlaid moons. Silk sheets covered her body. Warmth surrounded her. The scent of pinwood and winter storms filled her lungs. And beside her bed, standing like a sentinel carved from stone, was the Alpha King who had rebuilt the world in 3 seconds flat. The palace was beautiful in the way a blade was beautiful, all sharp edges and cold perfection. Anna moved through corridors lined with warriors who watched her like she might explode at any moment, their hands never far from their weapons. The marble floors were inlaid with silver that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. And everywhere she looked, moon symbols stared back, carved into archways, woven into tapestries, etched into the very stones. It should have felt safe. It didn't. "The healers are waiting," her guard said. A female warrior with ice-blue eyes and a permanence cowl. She hadn't given her name, and Anna hadn't asked. The healing chamber smelled of sage and moonflower. 3 healers waited inside. 2 elderly women and 1 stern-faced man, all wearing the silver crescent pins that marked them as court-appointed. Their expressions ranged from clinical curiosity to barely concealed revulsion. "Lie down," the eldest commanded. Anna obeyed, her hand instinctively covering her belly as they approached. The healers worked in silence, their hands glowing faint blue as they channeled their gifts. She felt the tickle of their magic probing, counting, confirming what no one had wanted to believe. The eldest healer pulled back sharply, her face draining of color. "Blessed moon," she whispered. "It's true." "What's true?" the male healer demanded, pushing forward. His magic swept over Anna's belly and he froze. That's impossible. 5, the second woman breathed. 5 distinct heartbeats. 5 complete souls. The room went silent. When was the last silver litter? The eldest asked quietly. 73 years ago, the male healer replied, his voice shaking. The moon quintuplets. He trailed off, exchanging loaded glances with his companions. They what? Anna asked, her wolf stirring uneasily. No one answered. By evening, the entire court knew. Anna could feel the weight of their stares as she was escorted to the dining hall, not to eat with the court, but to be presented. Valen sat at the head of a massive table, his expression unreadable as nobles and warriors filled the space with barely controlled chaos. Prophecy, someone hissed. Abomination, another countered. The texts speak of silver litters, children born to reshape power itself. The texts also speak of how they tear kingdoms apart. Anna stood frozen in the doorway as factions formed before her eyes. Some nobles looked at her with reverence, even hunger, seeing opportunity, political advantage. Others looked at her with naked fear, their hands moving in warding gestures as if she carried a plague. Valen hadn't spoken. He simply watched, his silver eyes tracking every reaction, cataloging every revealed loyalty. She's manipulated him somehow, a voice carried from a cluster of older nobles. Look at her. A broken omega with a fantastical story. The Alpha King never would have. Mind your tongue, Valen said softly, and the entire hall went silent. Or lose it, but the damage was done. Anna felt it settling into her bones. The suspicion, the accusation. They thought she'd seduced him, bewitched him, used her impossible pregnancy to gain power she had no right to claim. Her wolf snarled, pushing against her skin for the first time in months, angry and protective and trapped. A sharp pain lanced through her belly. Anna gasped, her hand flying to her stomach as something twisted wrong inside her. Not labor. Something else. Something cold spreading through her veins like poison. What? She started, but another wave hit, stronger this time, and her knees buckled. Valen was there before she hit the ground, moving with impossible speed. His arms locked around her as nobles scattered backward. The healers, he commanded. Now. My lord, the eldest healer said, arriving within seconds, her face grave as her magic swept over Anna. The palace wards. They're rejecting her. Explain. The stones were built to suppress rare bloodlines, to prevent a natural succession. Her pregnancy is. The healer hesitated. The palace itself is trying to end it. If she stays here, the pups will die. Valen's expression turned to stone. Then the palace is wrong. The bleeding started at dawn, and awoke to warmth spreading between her thighs. Not the wet heat of water breaking, but the slow, terrifying crimson of something going catastrophically wrong. She pressed her hand to her belly, feeling the 5 heartbeats that had been so strong yesterday now fluttering weakly, irregularly, like birds dying in a cage. No, she whispered. No, 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 no. The healers came quickly. Their magic probed deeper this time, and what they found made the eldest healer's face crumple with something between pity and horror. The words are ancient, she explained as Valen stood rigid beside Anna's bed, his hands clenched into fists. Built during the succession wars. Designed to prevent bloodline manipulation. To suppress pregnancies that could threaten the natural order of power. 5 pups. She shook her head. The stones read it as a threat. They're actively working against her body. How long? Valen's voice was carefully controlled, but Anna could hear the fury coiled beneath it. 3 days. Maybe 4. Then the pups will be too weak to survive and her body will stop. Valen's command cut through the room like a blade. Solutions. Now. Move her to a village, the male healer offered quickly. Outside the ward boundaries. The suppressant effect should fade within hours. No, another healer interrupted. She's too weak to travel. Moving her now could trigger full labor. None of the pups would survive. The door burst open. Court members flooded in nobles, warriors, advisors all talking over each other in a cacophony of fear and political calculation. This is a sign, an elderly noble proclaimed. The stones themselves reject this unnatural. We should move her immediately, a warrior countered. The bloodline must be preserved. End it, someone hissed from the back. And the pregnancy before it kills her and solves our problem cleanly. The room exploded into arguments. Valen's roar silenced them all. Oh, you two. They fled, all except Valen and the eldest healer who lingered near the door. My lord, you must decide. Leave us. The healer bowed and withdrew. Silence settled over the room like snow. Anna lay against silk pillows that felt like mockery now, her hands still pressed to her belly, feeling her children dying by degrees. She'd survived so much: the rejection, the hunting, the winter, only to be killed by the very walls meant to protect her. I'll leave, she said quietly. Tonight. I'll take my chances on the road. You won't make it a mile. Then I'll die trying, instead of lying here while your palace murders my children. Valen moved to the window, his back rigid. The stones are older than my bloodline, older than the crown. They've stood for 3 centuries. Then I'm sorry for the inconvenience of dying in your guest room. He turned, and the expression on his face stole her breath. Not anger, but something raw and almost fragile. You think I would let that happen? What choice do you have? You said it yourself. The stones are ancient. Immovable. Nothing is immovable. He crossed to her bedside, kneeling so their eyes were level. You carried 5 loves through winter and wolves and rejection. You survived when the entire world wanted you dead. His hand hovered near hers, not quite touching. Those pups have the strongest mother I've ever encountered. They deserve to live. Anna felt tears burning behind her eyes. They deserve a mother who isn't trapped in a palace trying to kill them. They deserve a palace that doesn't try to kill them. She laughed bitterly. And how exactly do you plan to achieve that miracle? Valen stood, his expression shifting from vulnerability to absolute determination. You'll stay in this room. You'll eat. You'll rest. You'll keep those pups alive. Valen, that's an order. You can't just command the stones too. I'm not commanding the stones. His eyes blazed silver. I'm commanding every mason, every runesmith, every architect in my kingdom. He moved toward the door. If the palace won't protect my future, then I'll build one that will. Wait, were you saying? He paused at the threshold. I'm saying the stones have 3 days to change. His smile was sharp as winter. Or I'll tear them down myself. The court convened at noon. Anna watched from a balcony overlooking the great hall, her guards standing rigid beside her as Valen addressed the assembled nobles, warriors, and advisors who filled the marble space below. The palace reconstruction begins today, he announced, his voice carrying effortlessly through the chamber. All court functions are suspended. All resources are redirected. The silence that followed was deafening. My lord, Lord Casimir, an elder council member, finally ventured, his voice shaking. Surely you don't mean. The palace has stood for 3 centuries, Valen interrupted. And in 3 centuries, it has failed its most fundamental purpose. Valen's eyes swept the crowd. It cannot shelter the future it was built to protect. Therefore I will be rebuilt. This is madness. A noble surged forward, his face flushed with outrage. For an omega, for a pregnancy that defies nature itself, you would tear down our ancestral. I would tear down the moon if it threatened what is mine. Valen's words fell like an executioner's blade. Anyone who disagrees is welcome to leave. Permanently. No one moved. The masons, runesmiths, and architects have already received their orders. Work begins within the hour. The hammering started before sunset. From her window, Anna watched as sections of the palace were carefully dismantled, not destroyed, but methodically taken apart by craftsmen who moved with reverent precision. Runesmith traced glowing patterns in the air, testing magical flows, mapping suppressant energies that had been woven into the very foundation. The eastern wing was worst, Valen said, appearing in her doorway 3 days later, covered in stone dust and looking more alive than she'd ever seen him. Built during the Succession Wars specifically to prevent multiple births, we've redirected it entirely. You're actually doing this, Anna's voice caught. You're rebuilding a 3-century-old palace because it was wrong. He crossed to her window, standing close enough that she could feel his warmth. The stones were laid in fear. Fear of power. Fear of change. Fear of anything that couldn't be controlled. His hand rested on the windowsill beside hers, not quite touching. I won't rule through fear. Below, workers were installing massive moonwood beams, their silver grain catching the fading light. Anna watched as runesmiths carved new patterns, not suppressant, but amplifying, protective, life-giving. 5 cradles, Valen continued quietly, carved from moonwood harvested during the last lunar eclipse. They'll be placed beneath an open skylight so the moon can touch your children before the world does. Anna's breath caught. Why are you doing this? I'm nobody. An Omega who stumbled across your borders half dead. You could have turned me away, executed me for trespassing, sent me to any village beyond your ward boundaries. Valen turned to face her fully, and the intensity in his silver eyes made her wolf surge forward, fully awake for the first time since her mate's death. The palace exists to serve the crown, he said. The crown exists to protect the future. You are carrying 5 futures I would burn kingdoms to preserve. I don't understand. Then understand this. He took her hand. The first time he truly touched her beyond carrying her unconscious body. His calloused fingers were gentle against her palm. Every time I close my eyes, I hear their heartbeats. 5 lives fighting to exist in a world that wants them dead. If I do nothing, I'm no different than the wolves who hunted you. No different than the healers who called you cursed. His grip tight and slightly. I won't be that king. Anna felt something crack open in her chest. Not breaking, but blooming. Her wolf pressed forward, recognizing something primal and true in the man before her. Thank you, she whispered. Valen's thumb brushed across her knuckles once before he released her hand. Don't thank me yet. We still have work to do. He left to oversee the night shift. Anna didn't see the elderly noble slip from the shadows of the corridor. Didn't see him pen a message with shaking hands. Didn't see the raven launch from the tower window, carrying word to the black wolves that still circled beyond the borders. She's vulnerable. The Alpha King is distracted. Strike during the full moon. 3 days. The conspiracy met in a chamber that didn't officially exist. A forgotten stone room beneath the oldest wing of the palace where the original ward still pulsed with ancient, unaltered magic. Lord Casemere, eldest of the noble houses, spread a map across the table with hands that had signed execution orders and peace treaties alike. The full moon rises in 2 days. The Alpha King will be in the Eastern Territories suppressing the rebellion. A rebellion you orchestrated, another noble observed dryly. A rebellion that was necessary. Casemere's eyes were cold. Valen has lost his mind, tearing apart our ancestral palace for an Omega carrying abominations. He's made us weak, vulnerable. The other packs are watching. If we're caught, a younger lord shifted uncomfortably. We won't be. Casemere traced a line on the map. The black wolves will breach the outer walls here. We'll ensure the gates remain unguarded during shift change. They'll reach the Omega's chamber before anyone realizes what's happening. And if they're questioned about how they knew the palace layout, they won't survive long enough to be questioned. Casemere's smile was thin. We'll arrive just in time to defend the palace. The Omega and her unnatural brood will be dead. Valen will return to find his mad project ended. In his grief and rage, he'll need his council's steady guidance. He'll know we betrayed him. He'll suspect, but he won't have proof. And by then the reconstruction will be halted. The palace will be restored to its proper order, and life will return to normal. One of the conspirators cleared his throat. The Black Wolves want confirmation. They want to know the Omega is truly there, that this isn't a trap. Casemere pulled out a sealed letter. Give them this. It contains details only someone inside these walls could know. The Omega's chamber location, her guard rotation, even the times when she's most vulnerable. He paused. Tell them to be thorough. No witnesses. No survivors. The letter was dispatched within the hour, and awoke to wrongness. Not pain, not yet, but a sense of disturbance that made her wolf pace restlessly beneath her skin. She placed her hand on her belly, feeling the 5 heartbeats that had grown stronger over the past week as the palace wards were slowly realigned. The reconstruction was nearly complete. New walls gleamed with fresh silver inlay. The 5 moonwood cradles sat in her chamber beneath the open skylight, waiting. Valen had worked alongside his craftsmen for 12 straight days, his hands as blistered as any laborer's. But yesterday, urgent word had come from the Eastern Territories. Rebellion. Villages burned. Valen had left within hours, taking his elite guard with him. "It's just until I return," he'd said, standing in her doorway one last time. 3 days. For at most. Now those words felt ominous. Anna moved to her window. The palace grounds were too quiet. Guards sparse. Shadows too deep in places that should have been lit. She pressed her hand against the new stone wall and felt something she'd never felt before. The palace was humming. Not the cold, suppressant pulse of the old wards, but something warm, responsive, almost aware. Her wolf surged forward, and suddenly Anna understood something impossible. The rebuilt palace wasn't just neutrally protective. It had been keyed to her blood, to her children. Valen had built her a palace that would recognize her as its heart. A cramp twisted through her belly. Sharp, but brief. Not labor. Not yet. But a warning. The pups were restless, sensing their mother's fear through the bond that connected them. "Not tonight," Anna whispered, her hand moving in soothing circles. "Please, not tonight. Your father isn't here." Another cramp. Stronger this time. She stumbled to the door, pulling it open to find her guard. But the corridor was empty. No warrior standing watch. No servants passing by. Just shadows and moonlight and silence. Wrong. Everything was wrong. Anna retreated into her chamber, her wolf snarling warnings. She grabbed the knife Valen had left on her nightstand, a simple weapon, but sharpened, positioned herself between the door and the cradles. The palace hummed louder, its magic resonating through the stones. She felt it reaching toward her, trying to warn her, trying to protect her. But the new wards weren't fully settled yet. They couldn't act without her. Another cramp eased her harder than before, and this time accompanied by a trickle of warmth that might have been water breaking or might have been blood. She couldn't tell. "Not now," she gasped. "Please. Not." The war horn sounded. 3 long, desperate blasts that shattered the night's silence. The attack had begun. And somewhere in the distance, too far away to help, Valen would be hearing those same horns and realizing he'd been played. Anna's water broke fully, soaking through her nightgun. Labor had begun. She was alone. The gates opened from the inside, and I heard the grinding of ancient mechanisms, the clash of steel, and then the howls, dozens of them, pouring through breaches that should have been impossible. Black wolves flooded the palace grounds like a dark tide, their eyes gleaming with bloodlust and purpose. Another contraction tore through her, and she doubled over, clutching the edge of the moonwood cradle. Her water had broken minutes ago. The contractions were coming faster now, each one more powerful than the last. Her body had made its choice. The pups were coming tonight, battle or no battle. "My lady." Her guard burst through the door, bloodied and wild-eyed. "We have to move you." "I can't." Anna's voice came out as a growl, her wolf surging forward as another contraction hit. "They're coming now. Then I'll hold the door." The warrior shifted into a massive gray wolf, positioning herself at the threshold as sounds of combat echoed through the corridors. Anna staggered to the birthing bed Valen had commissioned, low, wide, positioned directly beneath the open skylight where moonlight poured down like liquid silver. She stripped off her soap nightgun, her body moving on instinct, on something older than thought. The palace hummed around her, its new wards resonating with her pain, her fear, her fierce determination to survive. "Please," she thought desperately. "Valen built you to protect us. So protect us." The black wolves reached her corridor. Her guard met them with savage fury, taking down the first before sheer numbers overwhelmed her. She fell with a warrior's cry, buying in a precious seconds. 3 wolves crashed through the doorway, their muzzles pulled back in snarls. The lead wolf, scarred, familiar from the night at the border, shifted into the grizzled warrior who'd wanted her dead from the beginning. "Finally," he rasped, drawing a silver blade. "Time to end this abomination." He stepped across the threshold. The palace ignited. Silver light exploded from every surface, walls, floor, ceiling burning with lunar fire that responded not to ancient protocols, but to the Omega giving birth beneath the skylight. The wards Valen had rebuilt recognized her blood, her pain, her children fighting to enter the world. The warrior screamed as silver fire consumed him from the inside out. His companions tried to retreat, but the threshold had become a barrier of pure, burning magic. They died before they reached the corridor, their bodies crumbling to ash. Anna barely noticed. The first pup was crowning, and the pain was so immense it whited out everything else. She bore down, screaming her defiance at the moon and the battle and the world that wanted her children dead. The first pup slid into her hands. Tiny. Perfect. Wailing with fierce life. A girl. Anna had no time to do more than ensure the pup was breathing before the next contraction hit. She laid her daughter in the first cradle and surrendered to her body's demands. More wolves tried to breach the chamber. The palace burned them all. Silver light cascaded through the corridors like a living thing, seeking out threats, igniting anything that meant harm to the Omega in labor. The rebuilt wards had become a weapon, and Anna was its trigger. The second pup, a boy, came faster than the third, another girl. Anna's world had narrowed to pain and purpose. Blood soaked the birthing bed. Her body trembled with exhaustion, but she could feel two more heartbeats inside her, fighting to break free. The battle sounds changed. A roar split the night deeper, more primal than any wolf she'd heard before. It resonated through stone and bone, carrying rage and promise and absolute violence. Valen had returned. She felt him through the palace itself, through the wards keyed to her blood that recognized him as protector, as mate, as the one who'd rebuilt the world for her children. He tore through the invading wolves like a force of nature, his massive silver form leaving carnage in his wake. The fourth pup began to crown as Valen reached her corridor. He shifted mid-run, bursting through the doorway, covered in blood that wasn't his eyes wild until they found her. Found her alive, fighting, bringing their future into the world despite the chaos. You came back, Anna gasped. Always. He moved to her side, his hand finding hers as another contraction hit. I will always come back. The fourth pup, a boy, was born into his father's hands. Valen placed him gently in his cradle, then returned to Anna's side as the final contraction built. This one was different. Stronger. Urgent. The last child fighting hardest of all. Anna bore down with everything she had left. The fifth pup, the smallest, a girl with silver-touched fur, slid into the world as the full moon reached its zenith. Her cry echoed through the palace like a bell, and every remaining invader fell where they stood, the wards responding to completion. 5 lives born. 5 futures secured. The battle was over. Anna collapsed back against blood-soaked pillows, her body trembling with exhaustion so profound she could barely keep her eyes open. But she forced them to stay focused on the 5 cradles arranged in a perfect circle beneath the skylight, each one holding a small, squirming, impossibly alive pup. 5 heartbeats that had sustained her through winter and wolves and rejection. 5 lives that had reshaped a kingdom. Valen knelt beside the birthing bed, still covered in battle gore, his hand finding hers with a gentleness that contradicted the violence carved into every line of his body. He said nothing, just pressed his forehead to her knuckles and breathed. The chamber doors opened. Warriors flooded in, weapons drawn, then stopped dead at the threshold. 5 pups, all breathing, all alive. The wolves, Valen's elite guard, who'd fought their way back with him through rebel territories and invading forces, did something Anna had never seen before. They bowed. Not to Valen. To her. To the children. To something ancient and inevitable that even they couldn't fully name. Crownborn, one of them whispered, and the words spread like wildfire. The healers came next, their faces pale with awe and terror as they examined each pup with shaking hands. Ren, the eldest, the same woman who'd first confirmed the impossible pregnancy, placed her hand over her heart. Healthy, she pronounced, her voice breaking. All 5. Perfect. This. She looked at Anna with something like reverence. This has not happened in living memory. 73 years, Valen said quietly, still holding Anna's hand. The moon quintuplets. They remained the pack borders. The healer whispered, changed the balance of power for generations. Then it's fortunate, Valen said, his eyes never leaving Anna's face, that these 5 will have parents who will ensure they reshape the world for the better. Movement at the door. Warriors dragged 3 nobles into the chamber. Lord Casimir and his conspirators, their fine clothes torn, their faces bruised from interrogation. The traitors. My lord, the captain reported, They confessed to opening the gates, to coordinating with the Black Wolves, to planning the Omega's murder. Valen finally released Anna's hand and stood. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "You conspired to murder an Omega in labor," he said, his voice soft and absolutely lethal. "You betrayed your oath, your kingdom, your crown." He stepped closer to Casimir. "Give me one reason I shouldn't execute you myself." Casimir's face twisted with defiance, even in defeat. "Because she's made you weak." Valen's hand moved faster than thought, wrapping around the noble's throat. "She survived what would have killed anyone else. Carried 5 lives when the world said it was impossible. Gave birth during a siege while the palace burned around her." His grip tightened. "That's not weakness, traitor. That's strength you'll never comprehend." He released Casimir, letting him crumple to the floor. "Take them to the executioner's block. At dawn, let every noble, every warrior, every citizen see what happens to those who threaten the future of this kingdom." The traitors were dragged away, their pleas for mercy swallowed by the stone corridors. Silence settled over the birthing chamber. Valen returned to Anna's side, his fury melting away as he looked at their children. "They need names. Tomorrow," Anna whispered, exhaustion finally claiming her. "Let them sleep tonight as they are. 5 hearts under 1 moon." Valen pulled a chair to her bedside and sat, his hand finding hers again. "Then I'll keep watch. You need rest too." "I'll rest when I know you're safe." His thumb traced gentle circles on her palm. "Sleep, Anna. I won't leave." She believed him. As dawn broke, healers came to tend wounds and check the pups. Valen finally allowed himself to be cleaned, his battle-worn body washed and dressed in formal regalia. "The kingdom is waiting," his captain reported. "They need to see you. To hear what happened." Valen looked at Anna one more time, exhausted, bloodied, more beautiful than any queen who'd ever worn a crown. "Then let's show them their future." He strode toward the great hall to address a kingdom forever changed. They carried her to the great hall on a litter draped in silver silk, not because she was fragile, but because her body had given everything to bring 5 lives into the world and deserved to be honored for it. Anna wore a gown the color of moonlight, her dark hair braided with winter flowers. And cradled in her arms was the smallest of her daughters, the 5th born who fought hardest to enter the world. The great hall was packed. Every noble who'd survived the purge, every warrior who'd defended the palace, every citizen who'd been granted entry stood in absolute silence as she was brought before the days where Valen waited. He wore the full regalia of the Alpha King, black and silver, ancient and imposing, but his eyes were soft as they found hers. The litter was lowered. Anna stood on trembling legs, her wolf lending her strength, and walked the final steps alone. The crowd held its breath. Valen descended from the dais. And then, before the entire kingdom, the Alpha King of Winterhold went to one knee. Gasps rippled through the hall. "Anna," he said, his voice carrying to every corner despite its quietness. "You came to my borders hunted, rejected, carrying lives the world called impossible. You survived winter and wolves in a palace that tried to kill you. You gave birth during a siege, refused to flee, and brought 5 perfect children into this world through strength I've witnessed in no warrior, no ruler, no legend." He took her free hand, pressing it to his forehead in a gesture of reverence so profound that Anna felt tears burning behind her eyes. "You are not an Omega under my protection," Valen continued. "You are my mate, my equal, my Luna." He raised his head, his silver eyes blazing. "And any who doubt it can face me and challenge." No one moved. No one dared. Valen stood and turned to face the crowd. "These 5 pups, these children born under a bleeding moon, surviving what should have been impossible. They are crown-born. The future of this kingdom flows through their veins." He gestured to where the other 4 pups rested in moonwood cradles held by trusted guardians. "They will be raised not in the shadow of prophecy or fear, but in the light of what their mother taught us all, that strength is not about power but survival. That love is not weakness, but the fiercest protection there is." A warrior stepped forward, the eldest of Valen's guard. "What shall we call them, my lord?" Valen looked to Anna. "That choice belongs to their mother." Anna's throat tightened. She looked down at the tiny pup in her arms, then at the 4 others sleeping peacefully despite the crowd. "Thalia," she said softly, naming the firstborn. "Marcus. Belling." Roman. She kissed the forehead of the smallest. And this one. Luna. For the moon that witnessed everything. Thalia, Marcus, Eileen, Roman, and Luna, Valen repeated, his voice ringing through the hall. The frost-born quintuplets. The children who were made winter-hold. The crowd erupted. Not in polite applause, but in genuine, thunderous celebration. Warriors howled. Nobles bowed. Citizens wept. Furthermore, Valen said, his hand settling on the small of Anna's back. This palace rebuilt stone to shelter the future instead of suppressing it will no longer bear only my name. He turned to her. It will be called the Palace of Five Moons, so that every generation remembers the Omega who survived, and the children who changed everything. That night, after the ceremony ended and the crowds dispersed, Anna stood in her chamber beneath the open skylight. The 5 cradles were arranged in their circle, each pup sleeping peacefully, their tiny chests rising and falling in perfect rhythm. She remembered kneeling in the snow with wolves circling, certain she would die. She remembered the healers who'd called her cursed, the villages that had turned her away, the endless winter that had tried to claim her. She remembered collapsing against ancient border stones, accepting death, only to find salvation in silver eyes and impossible mercy. Valen came to stand beside her, his arm wrapping around her waist. "They'll write stories about tonight," he murmured. Anna leaned into his warmth, watching moonlight paint silver across her sleeping children. "Let them," she whispered, because she had lived the impossible, and tomorrow she would do it again. You have just listened to the epic story of the Frost King and his miracle from the Moonlight Mates Library. Valen and Anna proved that true power isn't about ancient laws, but about the will to protect what matters most. If you cheered when Valen tore down his own palace to save his unborn children, please hit that like button. Do you think 5 pups is a blessing or a handful? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell for more magical romances. Until the next chapter, sweet dreams.